This parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Don't be proud, be humble. Nobody likes someone who's arrogant. Humility is good. And that's all true. But if you've been here very long, you probably know that we should maybe dig a little deeper and look a little bit farther. We tend to read the parables as if they're fables, like Aesop's story about the hare and the tortoise, or the goose that laid the golden egg. They're simple stories with a fairly obvious and predictable moral. But Jesus' parables aren't so obvious and predictable. They often have a surprise turn, an unexpected twist that brings the listener up short. They can be confrontational. They can disrupt our usual way of thinking about things, and they can make us uncomfortable. Part of the difficulty is that they are about another time and place, one with which Jesus' listeners were familiar, but we are not. We lack the cultural context and experience to hear what they did. Another is that we hear the parables through our New Testament ears. The gospel writers were retelling Jesus' stories for yet a different time and place. The gospel writers were telling them for the Christian community after Jesus' death and resurrection, after the temple had been destroyed in Jerusalem, when Jesus' followers were being excluded from the synagogues and being persecuted by the empire. But Jesus' stories were for a Jewish audience. Jesus was a Jew. His listeners were Jews. And so the challenge for us is to try to leave behind our misconceptions and try to hear the story afresh, as Jesus' first listeners might have heard it. Now, one of Pastor Larry's favorite books about the parables is this one. It is called The Parables of Grace by an Episcopal priest, Father Robert Farrar Capon. And Father Capon writes about the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, the great banquet, the rich man and Lazarus, many of the parables that we have heard as we have worked our way through the Gospel of Luke this year. But he saves for the very last one at the end of the book, he calls it his finale, this parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And he begins by saying this: "Now, the first thing to get off the table is the notion that this parable is simply a lesson about the virtue of humility. It is not." Okay? So, how do we hear this parable the way Jesus' first listeners did? When we hear the word Pharisees with our New Testament ears, I think what comes to mind for us are Jesus' harsh words about the Pharisees. The gospel writers, again and again, use Pharisees as the epitome of those who were opposed to Jesus. So we come to the story expecting it to be critical of the Pharisees. But who were they, really? Surely not all of them were arrogant hypocrites that we've come to think of. I don't think Jesus' first hearers thought of them as the bad guys. The Pharisees were the forerunners of the rabbis. They were the teachers and interpreters of the law. But even more than that, they lived the law. They were all about not just orthodoxy, but orthopraxy. The Pharisees were the religious heart of Israel. They observed the Sabbath, they fasted, they tithed. They were good people. They didn't cheat and lie and steal. They went to the temple and they prayed. When we think about the tax collectors with our New Testament ears, we think of those who were marginalized and socially ostracized, to whom Jesus reached out. We think of the tax collectors as Jews who had been co-opted by the Romans and forced to do their dirty work. The tax collectors were like Matthew. Remember? Matthew, the tax collector, Jesus called him to be a disciple. Or like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was so eager to see Jesus that he climbed up a tree to get a glimpse of him. And then when he actually interacted with him, he was so moved and touched that he repaid people fourfold. So we come to this story about tax collectors with some sympathy for them. But Jesus' listeners did not. To hear this story the way they did, we need to realize how deeply the tax collectors were hated by the people. They were seen as corrupt collaborators with their Roman oppressors. Father Capon says they were sort of seen as mafia enforcers. They were cruel. They were callous. They extorted money from the poorest of the poor and took all that they had. They made a profit by skimming off the top of what they collected at the expense of their neighbors. At first, we come to this story with some disdain for the hypocritical Pharisee and some sympathy for that misunderstood tax collector. And so a moral about pride and humility seems pretty obvious. But Jesus' first audience came to this story with respect for the Pharisee and hatred for the tax collector, and they were brought up short. For them, the shock, the twist, the punch in the story was not the tax collector's humility. It was God's mercy for that tax collector. It was outrageous to them that God would have mercy for someone they saw as so reprehensible instead of the person that they saw as righteous. That tax collector's Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, was just too little and too late. I think they wanted to say, really, Jesus? You know, doesn't trying to be a good person and do the right thing count for something? The mystery of God's grace was mind-boggling for them. And honestly, it still is for us. Now, in the Presbyterian world that I come from, and also in Lutheran churches today is being celebrated as Reformation Sunday. Today is the anniversary of when Martin Luther hammered his 95 Theses on the church door. And in those churches, they talk about the essential tenets of the Reformation, chief of which is sola gratia, for all you Latin students, gratia, grace alone. And the Reformers lift up passages from the New Testament like, for it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God. It's not the result of works, so that no one may boast. Or, God saved us not because of any acts of righteousness we have done, but according to God's mercy. The Pharisees' problem, and ours, is that they felt they could score points with God by doing good works. That they could get God to love them and bless them more. But God isn't keeping score. In fact, God isn't even playing that game. God could not possibly love us anymore. God's love for us is beyond our imagining. We can't earn any more of God's love by doing good works. And we can't lose any of God's love. Thanks. We can't lose any of God's love by our sins and our failures. We spend all of our lives trying to justify ourselves, don't we? Because deep down, we're afraid we're not good enough. Thanks so much. Deep down, we're afraid we're not good enough. The good news is just too good to be true. It's too good for us to believe. But it's not about our righteousness. It is about God's relentless grace for all of us, Pharisees and tax collectors alike. So, where do you find yourself in this story? What do you hear? Maybe you're a Pharisee. I am. I come to the temple. I study the scriptures. I try to teach them and follow them as best I can. I thank God, like the Pharisees, I thank God for my blessings. I know for sure that they're not my own doing. I know that they are God's gift to me. But I need to hear again and again and again that I am already loved by God totally and forever. I don't need to be afraid of, I don't need to hide my weaknesses and my vulnerabilities. I don't need to earn approval, even though I sure keep trying. And I don't need to fear failure. I can embrace all of life, even the hardest parts, with courage and with trust and with freedom and with joy. Maybe you're a tax collector, and I'm one of those too. I realize that so many of the privileges I enjoy, the clothes I wear, the food I eat, come at the expense of workers who do not even receive a living wage. I am co-opted by empire in ways that I don't resist or challenge or even recognize a lot of the time. To which I can only say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Those words, God saved us, not because of any works of righteousness we had done, but because of God's mercy, could just as easily have been written by the prophet Joel. Israel had not done many acts of righteousness. They had turned from God again and again and again and worshiped other gods. But Joel announces to them God's outrageous grace. When their land had been destroyed and devoured by their enemies, God says, I will restore you. I will do for you what you can't do for yourselves. I'll make it rain. I will make it rain abundantly, early rain and late rain. I will make your bare threshing floors full of grain. I will make your empty vats overflow with wine and with oil. And even more, I will pour out on you my very own Spirit, on all of you, on men and women, on young and old, on slaves and free, on all flesh, on all people, Jews and Christians, Pharisees and tax collectors, on you and on me, and not because of any acts of righteousness that we have done, but because of God's amazing grace. Solo gratia, grace alone. Thanks be to God.